Fighting on all 360 degrees around the city of Pokrovsk in the red zone. Dangerous advances by the occupiers on the border of Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. And Russia is ramping up mobilization and plans to introduce year-round conscription, which means another 500,000 troops. Greetings to you. This is the Special Correspondent's On-Duty News program. We analyze information from open sources regarding the situation at the front. We use the deep state map provided by its developers. Our studio guest today is a reserve officer, former brigade commander of one of the AFU brigades, Oleksandr Saienko. Welcome. Even more cannon fodder. Russia, through its mobilization efforts, is preparing to increase the number of its troops in the war against Ukraine. Starting from 2026, Moscow will switch to year-round continuous conscription. Until now, this only happened in the spring and autumn, totaling 130,000 conscripts. At the same time, every month, the Kremlin brings 30,000 to 40,000 contract soldiers into the war. Given that the signing bonuses for contracts used to be $35,000 to $40,000, but now they have dropped, depending on the region, to $7,000 to $11,000 per contract. It is likely that the reduction in contract signing bonuses is precisely what led Russia to return to year-round mandatory conscription. If in 8 weeks Russia does switch to year-round conscription, it means that over the course of a year, the occupying country will gain an additional 500,000 troops. If we take into account that voluntary contracts remain in place, that's another 350,000. And then, in total, up to 850,000 Russians could appear on the battlefield. However, the aggressor is not stopping there and has already included the occupied territories of Ukraine into its southern military district and announced the mobilization of the years 1855. Previously, let me remind you, forced mobilization took place in the occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk regions and in Crimea. The enemy additionally plans to mobilize another 100,000 people from the Ukrainian occupied territories. And now the question arises, what should Ukraine do? What asymmetric measures should be implemented? After all, Kiev does not have the same human resources as Russia. According to military analyst Oleksandr Kovalenko from Inform Napalm, Ukraine must already be preparing for a war with a large-scale number of Russian occupiers. And this is a very bad situation for us. To advance at any cost, and that cost is the lives of Russian soldiers. The enemy has concentrated units from 3 armies at once in the direction of Pokrovsk, pressing simultaneously from the north, south and west. Due to the large number of personnel, the enemy managed to infiltrate Pokrovsk and amass forces for further movements in the area, disorienting our forward positions by acting from the rear and flanks. This is an unusual tactic. Why doesn't the enemy engage in battle immediately, but instead tries to disperse in the surrounding areas, waiting for more personnel? Due to gaps in our defenses in the south of Pokrovsk, the enemy was able to break into the city in small infantry groups from the direction of one Travnya and Troyanda. If you look at the map, at the deep state map, you can see that most of the city is already effectively in the red zone. And we are showing the directions of the enemy's attacks. What does this tell us? It tells us that the southern part of the city is already effectively occupied. For example, the Sonyaknai or Shakhtarsky districts are already effectively under enemy control, and the enemy has managed to reach this road. The T-0504 and advance along it. This arrow here shows the current direction of the enemy forces' movement. They are moving essentially in the area where the local fog is concentrated. Fighting is already taking place in the north, essentially on the outskirts of the city. Also, the fierce enemy managed to link up with its forces that were advancing from Kotlan along the tree line. They also managed to cut the highway and reach this spot, approximately where the former Vok gas station was, managing to link up and effectively block this part of Pokrovsk. That is, the enemy is now moving in the direction, for example, we see Zvirova. From the direction of Zvirova, they are advancing toward Hryshin along the reservoirs, while the other part of the enemy forces turned in the direction of Pavlohrad along this T-0504 highway. The enemy has also occupied Novopavlivka, which is to the southeast, and is moving toward Rivne. The situation there is also very tense and I would even say critical, since the enemy is also advancing from Chervony Lyman. And according to our information, they have managed to reach this intersection. That is, if they have cut it off, and if the enemy manages to reach the outskirts of Rivne, as we can see here, a large part of our troops, who are now putting up fierce resistance in this pocket, will simply be blocked. For now, we are not talking about a full encirclement, but rather a semi-encirclement. However, the situation is difficult, and as the soldiers themselves say, it is closer to critical. As a result of the successful, let's say, counter-offensive actions of our fighters, particularly near Rodnitske, in the direction of Suvorova and towards Fedorivka, the enemy has somewhat reduced the pace of their pressure in this sector, especially in the area of Chervony Lyman and Rodnitske. However, the enemy is not abandoning their intentions. So, in fact, the situation right now deserves attention because the enemy is trying to exert pressure on our positions, both from the north and from the south. And if you look at the situation, the enemy has made advances in the area of Novoekonomikne and Mykolaivka, in the area of Chervony Lyman from the north towards Mirnorad. There are also advances by the enemy's 2nd General Army from the direction of Mirolyubivka towards the outskirts of Mirnohrad and from the direction of Kozatska. In this direction, in fact, the enemy is already reaching this road, which is the ring road near Mirnohrad, called Stepova. If the enemy manages to reach this road, then let's say the issue of logistics for our troops, as well as the supply of ammunition and evacuation, will become very difficult and critical. Our soldiers, the 7th Air Assault Corps of the Air Assault Forces, are currently holding the outskirts of Mirnohrad. Thank you. They are clearing the enemy, in fact, from the streets and outskirts of Mirnohrad from sabotage and reconnaissance groups that occasionally infiltrate the city. The enemy is not abandoning their overall plan and is now trying to push from the direction of Mayak towards Pankivka in order to link up with their units concentrated in the direction of Shakov. As a result of our successful offensive actions, we managed to achieve this. The enemy was pushed back from Ivanivka, from Dorozhne, and essentially from the southern flank of Nikonorivka. The enemy has reserves significantly reinforced by the 2nd General Army. The enemy is deploying the 155th Marine Brigade here, trying to break through towards Shakov and in the direction of Sofiivka in order to unblock their forces concentrated near Shakov, who are again attempting to advance and attack Novishakov and Ivanivka. We managed to clear out a number of ravines, but the enemy is not sparing any effort or resources, so they are trying with all their might to advance at any cost. The enemy is rapidly advancing into the city and is already posting online the locations of the territories they have captured in the city of Pokrovsk, which until recently were under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. The situation is critical. Yulia Kirienko knows exactly what is happening in Pokrovsk. Here is her report.
These are drone pilots from the 25th Airborne Brigade trying to leave Pokrovsk, where their positions were located. They are evacuating the wounded because they had to engage in a firefight right in the residential neighborhoods of the city. The occupiers advanced there surprisingly quickly. They are being recorded in the hundreds and they are already taking up positions and mining the area. But most importantly, they are trying to block our infantry, which is still far from the city on the southern sectors. Our troops are gathering reinforcements in the Pokrovsk direction. There is news that the GUR is airlifting its special forces by helicopter. The General Staff is bringing in assault units and SSO combat groups, all to clear the residential neighborhoods of occupiers. The occupiers are already strolling leisurely through the streets of Pokrovsk and, as our reconnaissance drone recorded, are driving civilians out of the houses that still remain among the city ruins. Enemy groups began infiltrating Pokrovsk through Zvirova, a village in the southwestern part of Pokrovsk. From there, they moved on to Hrishain to cut off the road from Pologihorod to Pokrovsk. It was there that they hung the Russian tricolor last week. True, within an hour our FPV drones had already shot it down, but the enemy infantry remained in the city. Groups of Russians were spotted near the railway and in the central districts. The city is gradually turning into a grey zone and the Russians have increased pressure on it and the neighbouring Mirnohrad from 3 sides. Russia has amassed a force of up to 11,000 occupiers to push our troops out of the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. This is according to the 7th Corps, which is holding the defence there. Putin has already claimed that both cities are blocked, but that's not true. Enemy infantry are being hunted down and destroyed, and advancing is by no means easy for them.
Basically, it's about the movement of groups trying to concentrate at a given point. With their further movement, they transition to an assault, and the enemy may deploy small groups on motorcycles. There was also an incident 2 days ago when 2 motorcycles with their crews were destroyed. Today, too, some motor vehicles have been destroyed.
The Russians are acting in Pokrovsk just as they once pushed our troops out of Kushchina. First, they covered the entire sky. Above our defenders, drones, so much so that the infantry had to enter their positions over several days in a row, walking dozens of kilometers on foot with supplies and ammunition.
Sometimes for 3 days or more, they were forced to hide somewhere, waiting until the enemy shifted their attention away from them. If we take Pokrovsk now, groups are already entering there on foot, and from there, they move accordingly along.
Then they started pressing with infantry from the flanks. Their task, according to the defense forces, is to reach the road connecting Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad and block it in order to finally cut off the last remaining routes of communication with our infantry that still exist. The General Staff now states that despite the fighting in the city, our troops are not blocked. This is indeed the case, as confirmed by open-source intelligence analysts. But the infantry, which has been stationed on the outskirts of Pokrovsk in the Lisivka and Novopavlivka area for more than a year and a half, is in a very difficult situation. Yulia Kirienko, Special Correspondent 1+1.
We have already briefed you on the situation in Pokrovsk, and now we can ask Nazar Voitenkov, press officer of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, about what is happening in the Dobropilya salient area. Greetings to you.
Wishing you good health.
Let me remind our viewers that the brigade is raising funds for the repair and restoration of electronic warfare equipment. Please contribute. You can see the QR code on your screen. Join in. Every hryvnia is very important. Please tell us, how has the enemy's tactics changed? Is the enemy currently using a lot of heavy equipment in their assaults? And is it true that at the same time their mechanized units are pressing from different sides but in the same direction, trying to mislead us?
We noticed the presence of enemy armored units roughly from the beginning to the middle of the previous month in October. Around October 9th, the first mechanized attacks began, involving more than 10 armored vehicles, which we, together with adjacent units, successfully destroyed. In this way, the Russians tried to approach the area of the village of Volodymyrivka from different directions, where our 33rd Mechanized Brigade is currently holding the defense, as well as Shakov, and to engage the adjacent defensive lines, but essentially through joint actions. The defense forces managed to stop all these mechanized assaults, and overall, as I see it, the Russians did not reach the designated or planned lines for any of these combat objectives. At present, although I expected that we would see more Russian attempts to advance with vehicles, so far this has not happened. Currently, the enemy continues to reposition, and there are also some assault actions by the enemy. On foot, in small groups, they are trying to infiltrate between our lines into a sort of interpositional space. In particular, from my observations, I noticed that this is happening around Volodymyrivka, which is actually not the first time in the brigade's experience, when our servicemen continue to hold the defense, but the Russians, since they can't break through head-on, they try to find ways and routes to infiltrate from the left and right in order to identify weak spots. At the moment, we are successfully clearing out all these attempts, and if the Russians try to find any openings, we close them off. We achieve such successes because we actively use unmanned systems on our front, including Mashka bombers and FPVs, especially those on fiber optics, which perform excellently in areas where there is difficult terrain, such as basements, bridges, forest belts, and dugouts, where you need to have a good visual and be able to fly through narrow openings. Basically, we managed to do this, and in fact, this is how we continue to stop the Russians. Please tell me.
I wanted to clarify, Nazar, please tell me, has the enemy abandoned their intentions, or are they still pressing in the area of Shakhtarska Kanorika and Chervony Lyman? Please tell me, may I speak, about the fact that the intensity of attacks has decreased due to the occupiers' failures and because they have shifted their efforts a bit further south towards Myrnohrad? Or has the intensity not decreased after all?
I can't say that the intensity has decreased. Perhaps the number of vehicles and Russians involved in assault operations trying to penetrate deeper into our lines has decreased. However, overall, the number of assaults and the presence of Russians in our direction has not diminished. In fact, according to the testimony of our unit commander, it is known that the previous motorized rifle regiments that fought against us, as well as their neighbors in this direction, were simply wiped out. And that is why, apparently, now the Russian army has deployed marine units, but even they have not been able to achieve the desired rapid advance. In particular, the natural conditions have helped us a lot in this regard. Right now in Donetsk region, there is a lot of mud, and the excellent Ukrainian black soil is helping us because their heavy vehicles get stuck and bogged down in the swamps. We have had successful cases in this regard. One of the assaults ended simply because 3 vehicles got stuck in the mud. The entire landing party disembarked and ran back in retreat. In fact, after that, they were chased by FPV drones and heavy bombers.
Nazar, speaking of FPV drones, what is the situation in the sky right now? Whose drones are dominating in your sector? How often does the enemy use, besides this, tactical aviation and glide bombs in your sector?
I can't say there's an advantage, but it's clear that the presence of enemy UAVs is constant. They try to disrupt our logistics, but we've shifted part of the cargo, so to speak, onto the shoulders of UGVs. For example, since October, the crew of one of our robots has managed to transport about 2 tons of useful equipment, which we have used and continue to use against the occupiers. In addition, we resist them by eliminating their spotters along the routes and also intercepting in the air their UAVs and other drones that the occupiers use for constant reconnaissance. This is a constant problem. In fact, before attempting to advance, the enemy constantly carries out clearing operations with artillery crews and UAVs. According to some reports from my comrades in the mechanized battalions, between 40 and 70 drones can fall on the positions in a single day. And in fact, the frontline villages are also suffering terribly because Russian tactical aviation is carrying out total destruction and acts of terror from the perspective of civilian life, using guided aerial bombs on residential infrastructure. Even though the Russians are trying to prove something, the intended purpose in the sense that they are supposedly targeting coordinates, but honestly, when you see these towns, just destroyed houses, residential buildings, infrastructure, almost everything is wiped out. I believe this is simply total genocide.
Thank you for being with us. From the Dnipropetrovsk direction, we had Nazar Voitenkov, the press officer of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. Let me remind you, the brigade is raising funds for the repair and restoration of the electronic warfare station. The payment details are on the screen. Please join in. Mr. Oleksandr, please tell us, regarding Pokrovsk, practically the entire city is now in the gray zone. How long can the city hold out, considering the pressure from all sides and the disruption of our logistics? Is it worth turning it into a fortress like Bakhmut? And is it still better to save people and try to prevent this encirclement in that pocket near southern Shemoronggrad and Pokrovsk?
I can say that. Right now, the situation is such that political expediency must not outweigh operational necessity. That is, preserving the operational structure of our dedicated troops should now serve as the cornerstone that outweighs this political expediency, these fortresses. That pocket you showed to us right at the very beginning of the program, at the start of the show, it actually poses a greater threat to us than the situation in the city of Pokrovsk. Because this narrow bottleneck between Pokrovsk and Krasny Lyman, basically, for those who have been to Pokrovsk who know it, it's the entrance from the direction of Dnipropetrovsk, this ring, the entrance to the bridge. The enemy is now pushing there. And the stretch of road, this Rodinsky intersection at here.
Our defense is basically speaking based here at this location. So
the most logical thing right now would be to shorten the front line along this very section in order to preserve our troops and our capabilities.
in fact, this bottleneck can still be withdrawn now to avoid being squeezed from the flanks. So, and then align the fighting along this front line?
Absolutely. First of all, it will be shorter and easier to hold. Of course, the political aspect comes into play here. We see statements from both Putin and Zelensky. So, how much does this currently affect the conduct of hostilities here already? First and foremost, the figure of the commander-in-chief and the general staff should come to the fore. Thank you. I hope they are doing this now, calculating all the options, and that in the end they will outweigh political expediency.
We should discuss, both the gaps in our defense and the enemy's infiltration. Why was so little done to cut off this artery, the only road into the city, when they were coming in from the direction of Troyanda and 1st of May? Is this a failure in defense planning, or is it simply a lack of personnel? Or is it just the wrong data, incorrect reports from the military? Or maybe...
About half a year ago, we talked here in the studio, and back then we noted that the Russians had started using a new tactic, specifically infiltrating through our combat formations. And now they use this quite often. In other words, what used to be characteristic only of special forces or reconnaissance units. The Russians have adopted this as a standard tactic
for their infantry.
This is an unconventional tactic compared to what was used before. Instead of a continuous front line, they try to infiltrate as deep as possible into our defenses. This both disorganizes and complicates our defense. In fact, it also makes offensive actions more difficult. We need to take this situation into account and actually learn from the aggressor, from the occupiers. They are not standing still. There is
such an underestimation of the enemy, you can feel it. And
to increase, still, in my opinion, to increase the amount of mining, remote, any kind. That is, to mine as much as possible, including not only the approach routes, but also the front line, and possibly even our immediate rear. To come up with some new tactical techniques, specifically in the use of mining, in my opinion.
The situation is difficult in the southern Donbas direction. The Vostok troop grouping is advancing at the junction of the Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. Here, the enemy is operating with the forces of 3 combined arms armies at once, the 5th, 36th and 29th. The enemy is rapidly advancing along the Zaporizhzhia-Donetsk road. If you look at the map, you can see this salient, which is expanding in the direction of Zeleny High. Here we can see that the enemy, with the forces of the 29th Combined Arms Army, has actually managed to cross the Vovcha River to force it, and has essentially already entered Ivanivka from the northern side. There is also enemy advancement in the area of Zeleny High, as well as along the highway. Zaporizhzhia Donetsk, in the area of Pidubne. The enemy south of the highway is pressing on Oleksandrorad. You can see here we observe a dangerous wedge towards Novoselivka. The enemy has reached the Novoselivka-Sosnivka line. In other words, this line is very important for the enemy. The enemy, having occupied the settlement of Vorony, is moving on both sides from Vovcha towards Sosnivka, and right now he is advancing along both banks of the river itself. A unit consisting of 3 brigades from the 5th Combined Arms Army is pressing in the Verbov area. If you look at the map, you can see this dangerous salient. Here it is. 3 brigades, let me remind you, from the 5th Combined Arms Army. In other words, this salient is very difficult to defend. The enemy is present here. They are advancing, and these advances are very hard to stop because, according to the military, the enemy has a numerical advantage there, both in manpower and equipment. So they are pressing towards Verbov along the road beside the reservoir. The 36th Brigade of the 5th Combined Arms Army is pushing towards Vishnev. Here too, we can see that the enemy is making advances. Although a gray zone is shown here now, in reality, Oleksandrivka is already occupied. And this creates dangerous preconditions for a kind of semi-encirclement of our troops who are located in this corner. Since the enemy is also advancing with units of the 5th Combined Arms Army towards Oleksivka, and in fact from Oleksivka to Novo-Oleksandrivka, they are trying to link up and cut off part of our troops who are holding positions there. The enemy also managed to cross the Yanchul River in the area of Vishneve. Some of them, I repeat, have moved toward Novo-Oleksandrivka. The enemy has an advantage in manpower and in fact is not slowing the pace of their offensive. Further down the map, to the south, the enemy, specifically units from the 36th Combined Arms Army, is making advances. Now let me I'll go ahead and zoom in on the map now so that we can get a much better and clearer understanding of the situation that's currently developing in this particular sector. So here's the situation as it stands right now. The enemy at this moment currently has both reserves and active forces engaged, all of which are operating from this 36th Combined Arms Army, which is positioned in this area. They are pushing in the area of Pavlivka and Uspenivka, and they have made some advances. These advances are very dangerous, as the enemy is also trying to break through near Poltavka, creating very unfavorable conditions for us in the Huliai-Pol area. So in fact, the enemy is currently moving from Uspenivka itself towards Nova Uspenivka, and is also advancing northward in the direction of Pershotravneve. Already from Uspenivka, the enemy has directed its efforts further north towards Privilne and Rivnopilia. From Poltavka, the enemy is pressing towards Vesele and Zeleny High, generally in the direction of Huliai-Pole, where our territorial defense units are holding the line. The enemy has found large uncovered sections of our lines and with small assault groups is infiltrating and pushing into these areas. In this area, they are increasing their numbers into larger groups and attempting to assault our positions. What else could this penetration indicate? At the moment, we can't show it, but our defensive line, which is roughly positioned like this, from the direction of Spenivka, here they have actually already bypassed part of our defensive line. A similar situation is happening roughly in this area as well. From the direction of Olhivske as well, the enemy managed to bypass part of our fortifications from the rear. That's why the situation is quite threatening, and it has escalated in the Huliai-Pol direction over the past few weeks or even a month. Now, about the situation on the Novomikhailivka sector in the area of responsibility of the 67th Mechanized Brigade, we can ask the commander of the Iron Falcons Unmanned Systems Battalion, Vladislav Dotsenko. Greetings to you.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Let me remind our viewers about the fundraiser for drones for the Iron Falcons Unmanned Systems Battalion of the 67th Mechanized Brigade. Join in. Every hryvnia counts. The guys need these drones to destroy the occupiers. Tell me, please, how much has our logistics been complicated by the enemy's crossing? For example, along this same road, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, if we take it then to the south.
Yes, as you already mentioned earlier, right before the large-scale offensive on this particular section, the enemy, as we can clearly see, set their main objective as the destruction of logistics. This consisted in the fact that systematically, over the course of 2 to 3 weeks, the enemy carried out combined missile and drone strikes, thereby completely destroying the logistics across the Vovcha River, eliminating crossings in the areas of the settlements of Pokrovsk, Kolomitsi, and in the area of Dnipropetrovsk. In this way, they primarily destroyed our operational logistics in this area. In addition, they are widely using waiting drones on fiber optic cables, which the enemy positions on our main logistics routes, including now even on footpaths, in order to strike us. And in fact, in the same way, they can also detect us in advance.